was in question. It was so much in question that they were ready to fight about it. We were facing, in effect, a Maine civil war. Fusions disputed whether Davis could be governor. They challenged the election. Garcelon was trying to figure out what he's supposed to do. And all of these people were descending upon Augusta to say, excuse me, but we think we should be in charge. We think we were elected.
I feel your pain.
And the stuff that went on in Augusta at the time
last moment.
threatened to
Drove
terrify
down here like
not just
Bronx number
state government,
speed there
but the
just to
entire
get here and
existence of
down.
the state of Maine because of how these guys were acting. And they were all white men. There weren't any women in this. Well, so who's going to be in control? Who's going to decide this? And by the Constitution of the state of Maine in 1879, the answer was quite simple. The House of Representatives would select from the gubernatorial candidates 2 of the candidates whose names would then be forwarded to the Maine State Senate. The Senate would choose the victor. The problem with that was they were contesting who was in fact in control of the Maine State Senate. And the fusionists considered themselves in charge, and they were ready to take it over by force if necessary. And the Republicans were sitting there going, well, we think we're in charge, and we have the numbers to prove it. And then there was a challenge, the idea that James G. Blaine might have purchased votes, and that rumor got out about, and newspapers were really good about spreading it. And Blaine kept insisting that he didn't do it, but there were some expectations of people out there who had voted that somehow James G. Blaine was going to respect them for their votes in a way that they could appreciate it at any corner store. Anyway, Garcelon figured we're in trouble, so he orders that the arsenal in Bangor send down weapons. He wanted 120 rifles, and he wanted the ammunition to go with them. They tried to sneak out of the Bangor arsenal on Christmas morning of 1879. They were discovered, and a contingent of male citizens of the Bangor area stopped the shipment of arms to Augusta. Why would you want a shipment of arms going to Augusta? Because Augusta did not have an arsenal, and the weapons that would be needed in the event that there was an outbreak of civil unrest, according to Garcelon, he wanted help. What he wanted were not the musketoons that we saw earlier, or in fact muskets. What he wanted were the Springfield rifles. They were more accurate, you could load them faster, they were better at greater range, higher velocity, all of that. They were a better killing weapon. 5 days afterwards, on the 30th of December, those weapons made it to Augusta. About the time that Alonzo Garcelon was thinking, if I am to continue to serve, I could be considered illegitimate. My term is supposed to expire. We have this terrible debate going on here. It's a controversy. What am I going to do? For the first time in Maine's history, and we hope the last, Alonzo Garcelon did something that nobody had done, but he thought this could work. As they had people coming in by train, by horse, by buggy, any way they could get there. Now, bear in mind, this is winter, and they were coming to Augusta to battle for control of the legislature and the governorship. Lockmorrill's house was the home of one of the groups. They would gather there on Winthrop Street. The other headquarters was the Blaine house. And Alonzo Garcelon was so concerned about what was going on and who might approach the State House that he positioned sentries of a kind, but they actually were going to serve as snipers. He had armed people on the top of the State House, making sure as he looked north, they looked north, they could see the Blaine house, and they could see anybody approaching from what is now the West Side Rotary, but anybody coming down Winthrop Street and coming down State Street from Lockmorrill's house would be easily detected by these guys on the roof. Chamberlain who had already served as governor. Everybody knew who he was. He's 49 years old. And he's wondering, what am I going to do here? And he decided that the best thing for him to do was to abide by the request of the governor and to come to to come to Augusta. He arrives in Augusta, and the first thing he does is he sends all of the armed guards that Garcelon had, he sent them away. Go away. We don't need you. We'll decide this peacefully. That your existence, whether you're on the roof or in the hallways or at the front door, your existence exacerbates the tensions and endangers the public. And with that, they went away. Charles Nash is the Augusta mayor. Joshua Chamberlain summoned Nash to the State House. And he said, Mayor Nash, you're to keep the peace in the community. And what we want to do is I'm going to tell you, first of all, the guns have gone away and that I'm in charge. And now I want you to put the Augusta police to work because you will maintain order and peace in the community. Nash agrees to do that, recognizing that he has gangs, large gangs, dozens of men from all over the state in both camps coming into his community in the winter. So the question was, how do you identify them? Well, after Chamberlain discharges the Garcelon police force and he gets the mayor in, he declares that there will be a special police force. Kennebec County Sheriff's people kind of come in, and they guard Chamberlain, they guard the State House, but they're not to be open about it. It's not terribly ostentatious. What happens is the first and only example of Maine government infringing on the right to bear arms. Joshua Chamberlain declares that there will be no military company to be formed for any side while he is serving as, in effect, the de facto governor of Maine. He's in charge. He is the senior officer. Anybody brandishing a rifle, anybody carrying a rifle, was to be subject to confiscation of the weapon, if not arrest. So what they had was the opportunity for men to come to Augusta in the wintertime and not carry their rifle. Instead, they were going to be packing pistols. They were the first example, as the headline says, of a concealed carry. And they gathered in large groups. They come up with an idea that they don't want Chamberlain to be in charge. They think if they can get him out of the State House, they can install their people and they can settle the crisis of governance. So the fusionists collect down by where the Department of Transportation headquarters is now. They come up over the hill, and there are 2 or 3 dozen of them, and they are armed. They intend to kidnap Joshua Chamberlain. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. They intend to kidnap him. Chamberlain steps out on the portico of the State House, and he is unarmed. Not only is he unarmed, he's unfazed. And he looks at these guys, and he opens his coat. And he said, go ahead. Shoot me if you think you should. Some of the guys in the fusionist group had served with Chamberlain, had served under him, had served with him in the 20th Maine. And as you see, by God, the first man who lifts a hand against you, General, is a dead one. That's coming from the mob. So they look at Joshua Chamberlain, who's got to have just about the biggest brass you got going. He's looking at this mob of angry men. He stares them down. And they turn and walk away and pretend like it never happened. He didn't arrest anybody. He didn't bring out any armed men to guard him or to attack them. He met them one against about 35, 40 men. Stairs them down. Away they go. With that, it kind of broke. And Chamberlain resorts to the Constitution itself, that Maine has a process by which a governor will be decided. And he asked the Supreme Court for help in determining whether this, in fact, is a valid election. They determined that it is a valid election, that a plurality vote was sufficient for Daniel F. Davis to be elected governor. Davis, with Chamberlain's backing, Chamberlain then says, this is done for me. I'm out. You guys can take over. And Davis is a little leery about this. Now, after he asked the court, and they determine it, Davis says that he is the rightful governor. He forms his cabinet. The legislature is seated, and Davis, in his new position as governor, begins to assert his authority. Now, going back to the opposition research, Diarrhea Davis was a sobriquet given to him by his political opponents because they had done research on him. They'd gone into the Adjutant General's records and determined that Dan Davis, when he was transferred from the first U.S. I'll get this right. He was serving on the cavalry of the District of Washington, and he was in effect a policeman, a mounted policeman keeping order in Washington. And they transferred him, along with most of the others, into the 1st U.S. Maine Cavalry, which, for those of you who may not know this, was the most active cavalry unit of any Union force in the entire Civil War. And Dan came up sick, but looked to his critics as being an act of cowardice, claiming that he was sick. He was admitted to the hospital before he joined his Company F of the 1st Maine Cavalry. He eventually did serve, but the fact that he had, by his political opponents, he had ducked that service and feigned dysentery, which if any of you have ever had even a touch of diarrhea, sustained diarrhea was dysentery, and it was oftentimes fatal to these guys. And yet, there was Davis claiming that he had a touch of it. He went in, it might have been something. Anyway, he wound up serving. And as he served, he realized that he did not have the cachet that Joshua Chamberlain had. And the fusionists were still out there. So he came up with his own idea of gun control. He calls up the Androscoggin Light Artillery, and he asks them to come to Augusta and position a Gatling gun on the front steps of the State House. By comparison, it might be considered today's AK-47. It was not considered a hunting rifle, it was a killing machine. And if those 3 dozen guys came back after Daniel F. Davis, Diarrhea Dan, they were going to be looking at a Gatling gun. Things quieted down after that. The legislature was seated, the mobs dispelled, the government went forward. It was the only time in Maine when martial law was declared and a respected citizen was placed in charge of the entire military of the state in the state of Maine. December of 1879, January of 1880, and February of 1880. Chamberlain is in Augusta for less than 2 weeks. Davis takes over, and 2 weeks later, the government reconvenes. It's the only time that the right to bear arms in Maine was challenged, and nobody challenged when Garcelon demanded it and Chamberlain backed it. That's a little bit of history. And now I turn it over to the guys who are going to do modern stuff. Thank you.
Good Super Bowl afternoon. My name is David Trahan. I'm the Executive Director of the Sportsmen's Alliance of Maine. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I was born in Lauderdale, Maine. I have been around guns since I can remember. I can't remember firearms not being part of the home that I grew up in or part of my life. I eventually moved down to the coast, eventually serving in the legislature for about a dozen years. In that time, I served on the Inland Fisheries and Wildlife Committee, established actually the legislation that created the Government Oversight Agency, which I served on, which is our state's watchdog group. In addition, I chaired the Taxation Committee. You might say I was an active legislator. I love policy. I like solving problems. And over that adult lifetime, I eventually became drawn toward the community that I now represent. I represent the Sportsmen's Alliance of Maine, which was established in the mid-'70s. And it was created to defend firearm and hunting rights. And people now see the Sportsmen's Alliance of Maine a little bit different. We cover about 150 to 200 bills a session. I'm a lobbyist. I go out and everything from trapping to land conservation, firearms, hunting, everything in between. Our organization is seen as a leader statewide. I have watched this earlier presentation about Maine, and I think one of the things that we can start this forum out saying and recognizing is that Maine maybe isn't the same Maine that was described earlier. We are the safest place in the country to live. We have the oldest population in Maine, but here we have a 67% below average, national average for all violence. Now I want to repeat that. The national average of violence, Maine is 67% lower than the national average. We have about 20 homicides here in Maine a year. On average, it's around 24, but lately it's been around 20, so our numbers are going down. 6 straight years, violent crime in Maine has been in decline. We are doing something right. And as we get caught up in that national debate, I might want to turn this around a little bit. The University of Maine, perhaps, is a good place to start. Maybe folks should be looking at Maine as to why we are the safest place in the country to live. I think it's because we're community-based, we're passionate about helping our neighbors. We make sure that our kids know how to use firearms properly and how to act responsibly around them. So I just want to start this whole discussion out from that standpoint. We are not Chicago. Chicago has more killings in one weekend than we do in the entire state of Maine in a year. And that's something we should be proud of. It doesn't mean that we stop trying to make our communities safer as it relates to firearms. It just means that we're doing something right. So I'll start with that. My organization represents 63 fish and game clubs. I personally have represented as a president and a secretary one of those fish and game clubs, and I did so for over 20 years. Our between 8,000 and 10,000 members across the state. Many of those individuals are the instructors that teach our kids how to live responsibly with firearms. And my community that I represent are probably, I know they're instrumental in those numbers that I just gave you earlier. They are the folks that give of their time freely. They do not ask for compensation, to take courses to learn to be instructors, to teach the next generation how to responsibly live with firearms. I am proud of that community, and I will defend them. They are the ones that I think have helped establish this culture of living safely with firearms. So with that, I have an approach that I'm taking this year, and my board has approved me doing this. It wasn't hard to get them to do it. I said to them, instead of letting others define what gun safety is, how about I go out and actually describe what we believe from the firearm community, what we believe gun safety is. I was invited by the Kennebec Journal, I think was here earlier, to do a series of columns. The first one was out last week. There'll be 4 of them on the next, well, this Monday and then 2 more Mondays after that, to describe what we believe is gun safety. It is not gun control, as some groups, who even call themselves that, are promoting. It's how do we make Maine a safer place to live with firearms? How do we teach our kids to be safer with firearms? It's school safety, which I hope we get a chance to talk about later. It's education, it's mental health, it's suicide, it's all of those things, and how do we make our community safer? That's the approach we are going to take, and I think we have very legitimate and very responsible ideas on how to do that. I look forward to maybe talking with the Gun Safety Coalition about many of those, and at some point, I think you're going to see a very thorough and thoughtful debate about what is gun safety, and that's to everyone. So with that, I'll stop. So thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Jeff Bickford. I am the Executive Director of the Maine Gun Safety Coalition. I've been in the job since 1st of August of this year, so not too long. First of all, I want to thank our hosts, the Forum on the Future and the University of Maine at Augusta, and to Chuck and Grace for hosting this really important and wonderful event. Thank you all for attending. Again, I know it's been mentioned that you guys should be pre-gaming and tailgating, and it's really very fortunate that we live in a place that has such interest in important topics and civic engagement that you would all come out on what is essentially a national holiday. So I'm going to do my best to work through just a couple points fairly quickly. I will start by saying, first of all, like 50% of Mainers, I have a really bad cold, so I apologize for any coughs. And I'm a little intimidated because I'm just completely outnumbered by Daves today, but I'll do my best to represent the non-Daves. I want to talk a little bit about myself, first of all, and I think you'll find that we have a lot more in common. Dave from the Sportsman's Alliance and I have a lot more in common. I have a lot more in common with the shooting community than might be suspected from the idea of Maine Gun Safety Coalition and Sportsman's Alliance of Maine being at odds. I grew up in a town called Manchester outside of Hartford, Connecticut. I started shooting firearms for sport when I was either 7 or 8. I don't remember, but it's certainly been, I've been doing it a lot longer than I haven't been doing it in my life. It's a sport I love tremendously. I did it with my father. I started with my father, and I spent a lot of really quality hours with him learning about gun safety, learning about guns, learning about firearm history, learning to respect firearms and how to handle them properly, and how to become a better marksman, which I really enjoy. On Sundays, when other kids would play football or skateboard or whatever it is those crazy kids did, I went to the rifle range and I spent 4 hours honing my skills as a marksman. Until I went to college, and then after I left and returned from college. So, and a lot of time, we spent a lot of time working on restoring antique and historical firearms, especially from World War II. And that's a hobby I still really enjoy. So that's my background. But when I think about the conversation about guns, gun safety, gun control, whatever you want to call it, I frame the conversation by 2 sets of statistics. Or not statistics, excuse me, 2 sets of numbers. And the first numbers are 554 US 570 and 561 US 742. And so for some of the lawyers, if you're out there, or history buffs, you'll know that those are that's the US report citation to District of Columbia versus Heller and McDonald versus City of Chicago from the Supreme Court of the United States. And what those cases established was that there was an individual right to firearms that was enshrined in the Second Amendment of the Constitution. And that was in Heller, and a few years later in McDonald, that said that that applies to the states, that states must also recognize the Second Amendment right for an individual to possess a firearm. As a citizen, and as a lawyer, and as an advocate, that is where the conversation begins. I'm not here to debate what the Second Amendment means, the historical context of it, and I do think that plays a role, but the fundamental starting point is that that's the law of the land. So we have to recognize that, and we're not going to litigate that literally anytime soon. But on the other hand, there's a second set of numbers. In 2017, we had 40,000 people die nationally from gun violence. Background checks, which have been in place since about 1994 and is a federal program, have stopped more than 3 million illegal gun sales. But at the same time, studies show that when people purchase through a select group of online firearm sales forums, that the people purchasing there were 4 times more likely to fail a background check had one been conducted, but you don't need one because they're not being done through federal firearms licensed dealers. 80% of firearms that were acquired for criminal use don't go through a federal firearm dealer, so there's no background check. At the same time, for the concept of universal background checks, that's an Quinnipiac poll from February of 2018, so about a year ago. 97% of Americans, 97% of gun owners, and 97% of the Republicans supported universal background checks. Some other numbers that I think are important to keep in mind. In Maine, we have a suicide every day and half of those are committed with firearms. Every day, 47 children in the United States are shot, 8 of them die, 4 murdered, 3 commit suicide, and 1 die from an accidental and unintentional death. And so what that means over the course of an average year is that 2,737 children die from gun violence, and 124,760 Americans of all age are shot, and of that, 35,141 die. So that's the other set of numbers that we keep in mind, or I think it's important to keep in mind when you're talking about what the Second Amendment means and what gun safety and gun control means, and where we need to go, if anywhere, but hopefully we'll settle that today. So that's how I think of my job, is how do I work within the confines of what the Second Amendment means as interpreted by the Supreme Court, and how do we lessen those numbers? And that seems like it may box us in, but it doesn't. And the reason is because what we focus on at the Maine Gun Safety Coalition is safety. We're not the Maine Gun Control Coalition. We are not the Maine Gun Abolition Coalition. We're the Maine Gun Safety Coalition. So I want to take a second to talk about the work that we do. We really have 2 buckets of work. We've been around for about 20 years, and over that time we've raised money and distributed, free of charge, 25,000 free trigger locks to anyone who needs them, no question asked. We have them in police stations, we have them in medical offices, we distribute them in our programs or wherever we're at when we're doing a public event. You need a trigger lock, please come get one. We're not judging you for having guns. We have no problem with you having guns. What we want to do is make sure that if you have a firearm, that you store it safely, to make sure that the kid can't get a hold of it, that if it's stolen, it's just a piece of metal, or that if there's someone in your family that's suicidal and you know they may act on that, that it will be prevented from doing that. So that's one bucket of work we do. The other bucket is that we do advocate for gun safety laws, mostly in the state of Maine. The vast majority of our work is in Augusta, though we do from time to time chime in on issues at the federal level. And so a few of the things that we're working on this year that we think are very important, and again, these are things laws and policies and ideas that have been imported from other areas where these laws have been seen to work. They've been tested, they've been refined, they've been challenged in the courts of law, and so we may have the benefit of having these laws being implemented in many other states. We can see how they work or how they don't work, and then we can model them to what we need in Maine. So the first one I'll talk about is a bill called LD 85, which Mr. Tran testified on very well the other day, I will say, and I sent him an email thanking him for his testimony on that. It's a bill that would allow tax credit for anyone who buys a storage locker or a safe or gun safety device to encourage people to lock their firearms up at home. And I think that's a great example of how we don't really have the debate that people think we may have and the public may think we have in this state. Our focus is on gun safety, the sportsman's focus on gun safety, and preventing tragedies. And so that's a place where we've come together, both supported and strongly the same piece of legislation. We've issued a statement in support of it. We've encouraged our members to call their our members to call their representatives and let them know that that's an important piece of legislation. We also have some other bills that I know that Sportsman Alliance does not support. In fact, they're strongly opposed to. And that's okay. That's our democratic process. But we think that they're important gun safety measures that don't restrict the Second Amendment right. And so I'll start first with what's called, it's commonly known as a red flag law, but we call it an extreme risk protection order bill. And what that does is if you have a friend or family member who you know is suffering from some kind of mental health crisis, they threaten to kill themselves, they threaten to shoot up their school, that they're really angry at some neighbor, and you have a concern that they're actually going to act on that, and that you can go to the police, or you can call the police themselves, or you can go to the court yourself and say to a judge, I'm really worried about this person, and I know they have access to firearms, and I'd like you to just take their guns away for a small amount of time so we can evaluate this and hold this off and make sure that there's not an incident. And the judge has to hear the evidence, and it's under oath. So if you lie, you go to jail. So I know there's a lot of concern, or anybody can come in and say anything they want, but the penalty is, if it turns out that it's done to get back at a boyfriend, or you just don't like this guy, that's a felony. So that's not the concern I think that's made out to be. But what it does do is allow a judge to fairly evaluate the evidence, and it's finding a probable cause. What they would be able to do is issue an order that says to the police, go say, okay, we understand there's something going on here. You're going to surrender your firearms for no more than 14 days. We're going to give you a lawyer free of charge, and then you come back to court within 14 days. That's the outside. Could be 3 days, could be 10 days. We're going to have a full hearing. We're going to decide whether you need some treatment or some help before we restore your firearm privileges, or maybe there's a misunderstanding, and please, the police will return your firearms right now. So that's one bill that is extremely important to us, that's worked in other states, just passed in Vermont last year, and there's a pretty well-known case that received some national attention where a kid who had access to his parents' firearms made repeated threats to shoot up his high school and had gone through, but that stopped a mass shooting. At the same time, this is not a wholesale attack on Second Amendment rights, on anybody's ability to possess firearms. We're talking about maybe a dozen cases a year in the state, but probably less. So it's not the kind of broadside attack on an individual's right to possess a firearm that it's often portrayed to be. And then I'm just going to touch on one other bill that's pending in Augusta and also pending at the federal level, and that's universal background checks. As I mentioned before, the only firearm sales that are subject to a background check are those that are completed by a licensed federal firearm dealer. So basically at a gun store, not at a gun shop, at a gun show, and not if you would pick up a local periodical that advertised a gun for sale and you called that person, so let's meet in the 7-Eleven parking lot, I'll give you $400, you give me the gun, there's no background check there. Again, 97% of Americans support this. And how it would work is that if you wanted to consummate a sale like that, that's fine, that's absolutely your right. You would just go to a federal firearms licensed dealer who would complete the background check, have you fill the paperwork, and then when it comes back clean, as it almost always does, the sale will be completed. And so I just take that as a second example of what we think is, it does not forbid or restrict a class of firearms, people from possessing firearms, people who have guns in their home now. What it does is make sure that people who should not have guns, federally convicted felons, people with domestic violence offenses, someone with one of the enumerated mental health issues or mental illness issues in their past would not be able to have a firearm. Most people in this room and most people in this state would have nothing to worry about except for maybe the $30 fee that the licensed dealer would be allowed to charge to complete the sale. So I use those as illustrations of bills that are pending now in Augusta and Washington. And I'll point out that the Extremist Protection Order I mentioned has a companion bill in Washington, D.C. The author of that is Marco Rubio, and the two co-sponsors of that are Senator Collins and Senator King of Maine. Those are the only people signed up for the bill right now. So when we talk about bipartisan support for common sense gun safety, that's Senate Bill 7. I think that's a perfect example. But what we're here to do is make sure that lives are saved and that tragedies are avoided within the confines of what the Supreme Court has defined as a Second Amendment right. And I look forward to your questions. I look forward to working with both the Daves on trying to see what we can get done together here in Maine. And I'll just close by saying, go Pats. Thank you.
Remind you all that there'll be a break now. I think it lasts 15 to 20 minutes. And come back here and I will take your questions if you've written them down on the little piece of paper. I guess it's a little card. And I'll take those and then I'll field the questions. The panelists will be sitting up here. And which I thought they were going to be doing in the beginning. So they'll be sitting up here, and as I field the questions, I'll be standing here, and hope you can hear. So, want to see you back, and enjoy the break. Thank you. One other thing. An article by David Trahan was in the KJ on, I believe it was February 28th, and it was all about. I'll start with one. Some of them you can decide whether you want to answer it or not. They're quite a few, David. So with the ones that haven't named a person, then I'll just say that would be best. Discuss why we don't have any assault weapons. Why we don't have any assault weapons taxes.
Well, kind of a strange question, but I'll try to answer that question. We don't have so-called assault weapons legal for citizens. Assault weapons in the military sense are firearms that can be fully automatic. They have been illegal for individual citizens to own since I believe 1986. There was another federal law in 1968 that was passed that regulated firearms as well. So you can't own a so-called assault weapon. Really what that should say is firearms that appear to be military style. They may have a stock or the look of them, they look like a military, but they're a semi-automatic firearm, which means that in order to fire it, you have to pull the trigger once, and then you have to pull it again. You can't hold the trigger and it will repeat fire. An AR-15 is probably the most common firearm that people believe looks like an assault weapon. An AR-15 is simply a semi-automatic firearm. AR does not mean assault rifle, it means armor light rifle. That's another misnomer out there. It's really just a semi-automatic firearm. I have 5 or 6 of them that I use for hunting, whether it's duck hunting, bird hunting, or regular hunting. You can use a semi-automatic. They've been around for 100 years. There has been a national debate around them. There is a tax on firearms and ammunition called the Pittman-Robertson Act. excise tax. That funds departments like Inland Fisheries and Wildlife around the country that manage wildlife. So there is a sense of tax on firearms and ammo already.
What can be done about the availability of the huge amount of ammunition for automatic weapons and the availability of those weapons, which are being used over and over again for mass killings? These seem to go beyond a person's right to bear arms to protect one's home.
Well, as Dave just said, automatic weapons have actually, I think, been banned since the days of Prohibition, when machine guns and sawed-off shotguns were banned by Congress, and the Supreme Court upheld that law in a case called Miller that, again, I think dates to the era of Prohibition when you had gangsters and Tommy guns. So far as I know, an automatic weapon has never been used in a mass shooting in the United States. It's only been semi-automatic weapons. Some confusion may come from the Las Vegas massacre, where the person, I hesitate to even use that word, who perpetrated that act used what were called bump stocks, which you may have seen in the news. They were recently banned by the ATF in a regulatory decision. And what those allowed a shooter to do is, it's a device that attaches the firearm and essentially allows you to keep your finger on the trigger and then uses the recoil of the gun as it goes back and forth to fire on to shoot the gun more rapidly than it otherwise would in semi-automatic mode without a bump stock. There's also a manner of doing that, quote-unquote, bumping without a bump stock, but that's probably as close as you're going to see to anything related to automatic guns. What are commonly used in mass shootings are semi-automatic AR-15s, which is the civilian version of the M16, which was first developed in Vietnam, in which numerous manufacturers in the country still produce. And so I guess to answer that question directly, automatic weapons haven't been used in a mass shooting. You want to talk about the availability of semi-automatic rifles. The part of what increases the lethality of a shooting in those instances, in a mass shooting incident, especially in a closed space, beyond just the, you mentioned a bump stocks, which I mentioned before, are two things. One, these are very high-powered weapons. 223 is the caliber of the AR-15. It's an extremely powerful round. Again, it's designed for military use, and it really destroys the internal organs of someone if you're shot. It's extremely powerful, and it's designed to be accurate and lethal at a very long range, 100, 200 yards up to 500 yards if you're a single marksman. And so you can imagine the damage that would do in an enclosed space, such as the Pulse nightclub or a classroom. The other issue is that you have the availability of large capacity magazines, which allow someone to fire more rounds more quickly without having to change the clip or the magazine. And so that allows you to get more rounds before, in theory, someone might intervene in the shooting. And so there's been several states that have banned large capacity magazines, which are usually defined as 10 or more. New Jersey is one, I think California is another. So that kind of goes to the question of why these AR-15s are used so frequently. I can't get into any shooter's mind. I don't think we have any idea of knowing what shooters are thinking, but that's why the number of deaths is so high, or reasons why the number of deaths is so high when the use of these firearms.
This question is for you, Mr. Trigan. Do Maine hunter safety trainers tell its students how far shotgun pellets will travel? If not, why not? How far will they travel?
Well, getting back to the ballistics of firearms, I'll get to the shotgun in a second. The AR-15 is not a high-powered rifle. In our world, we call that a varmint rifle. That caliber was designed for one purpose, and that is in war to not kill but to injure. That caliber was designed so that if one soldier could wound another, then it would take another group of men or women to take care of that individual on the field. It would consume the resources of that military, one side or the other. Another AR-10, that's a .308 caliber, that's a hunting caliber, that's for hunting moose, bear, deer. That's a higher caliber firearm. The AR-15 is not a high-powered caliber. Shotguns, they're different. Their ballistics are much different. Depending on the powder, the size of the shot, determines how far those pellets will go. Buckshot will travel a good distance. That's a much bigger lead bullet. It can be several in the shell. It's meant to scatter. Those are dangerous in all circumstances. They travel a good distance. You have steel shot, which is much different. That's for duck hunting. That travels at a much higher rate of speed. Lead, depending on the size of the shot. So without knowing what that shot is, the lower, this is the one rule that you should use, the lower the shot, the more powerful it is. Like a number 8 shot is used for skeet, which is for breaking the little clay pigeons. A number 2 shot would be used for duck hunting at long distance. So that's how you tell the difference between shotgun shells.
Will Sam help us close the background check loophole that allows Uncle Henry's gun shows and private sellers to sell guns to people without a background check? This person said, I went door to door to encourage people to vote for this. I found people wanted to close the loophole, but Sam and others can't convince them not to vote for it because of details like lending their gun to a friend. Thank you.
Well, first of all, whoever was part of that process, my hat's off to you. You participated in the Democrat process. That's the way it's supposed to work. You bring a law forward. And so for whatever it's worth, I agree with your right to do that. I congratulate you for it. As far as that law goes, Jeff's organization worked very hard on the other side of that. And that law was drafted in another state. It was a bill that has been promoted around the country. And the version of that bill, when it came to Maine, lawyers working for his organization approached me and said, are you guys going to stay out of this? And I said, I read the law, and I'm sorry, you made a mistake when you drafted this legislation and thought you were going to come to Maine, and we were going to sign off on it. It had a provision in it, under federal law, 1986, as part of the Gun Control Act as it was amended from the 68 version. Even the federal government recognized that there's an exemption for the temporary transfer of firearms between individuals in a sporting situation. So in other words, if I'm at hunting camp and my buddy wants to borrow my firearm, I can let him do that for a short period of time and no background check is required. They drafted that legislation to require background checks for even casual sales. They said that they put in exemptions to it. Those exemptions were cumbersome at best and unrealistic. So I wasn't the one that defeated that background check initiative. When they drafted it so poorly, they defeated it themselves. All I did was tell people what was in it. That's my job. You will find everything that I put on the table here today, in the future, in the newspapers, I stick to the facts, and that's what I'm going to do here. The reality is that was not drafted for Maine. I said it in the debates. I was the lead debater on that subject. I said, look, I'm sorry, but that provision will break the culture that we use to teach the next generation of responsible shooters. When I take a new person out to mentor them, to hunt or to shoot, I have to be able to transfer the firearm to them temporarily so that they can handle it and learn how to shoot or learn how to hunt. We saw that as severing that ability for us to teach the next generation the responsible use of firearms. And that's why we worked on it.
Just to follow up quickly, the law that we have put forth this year and that will be debated in Augusta on background checks takes care of that issue. It allows specifically and in text to allow for transfer in a hunting lending situation, and it allows for interfamilial transfer. So you can gift a gun to a family member to an estate or as a gift or anything like that without a background check. So we've removed those issues. We recognize that they were problematic during the referendum, and so we're hopeful that there'll be a reconsideration of the bill that we've put forward this year.
Is the school environment safer with no gun on property?
Is the school environment safer with no gun on the property?
Yeah, I'm glad for the question around school safety. The history of school safety in Maine, for me, goes back to when I was a state senator. After one of the school shootings, I introduced an order, I believe I was still a senator at the time, to direct the Department of Education to look at school security statewide and report back to the Department of Education and the Education Committee on whether our schools are safe. That report came back, and most of it, unfortunately, had to be kept confidential because of the problems that were out there. But generally, what they found was that wealthier urban school districts are safe, relatively safe, and have good security. Many of them have resource officers in the school. But rural Maine was a different story, that many of those schools needed upgrades in school security. I drafted and introduced a bill, just like the gun safe bill that we were talking about, he was talking about earlier. I drafted that bill as well and was introduced on our behalf. The school security bond that we introduced would have distributed money through the school renovation fund. For those that don't understand that fund, the way it works is if you apply for a grant for, say, school security under our bond, and you were a poor district, you were relieved of paying that back. Where the wealthier school districts, because they could afford it, would pay back their loan. That was designed to bring the security measures at rural schools up to the same levels as urban schools. Unfortunately, during the fiasco at the end of the session, that bill got caught up in it, was never finally resolved. In that was also a requirement to create a school safety clearinghouse within the Department of Education for school districts, which in Maine are very independent, don't share information, to come to the table and learn of the state-of-the-art school security devices, technology to beef up schools. It was a clearinghouse for the schools to share that information, get access to money, and to also do so in a confidential way so that those school districts were not revealing their lack of security at their schools. We thought that was a very responsible bill. Patrick Corey from Wyndham has reintroduced the School Safety Center bill. We've got really good feedback from Maine School Management. We believe that that will beef up security in the long term. Are guns safe in school? In the right hands? Resource officers currently do carry firearms. They have training. Two more things that need to be addressed. School resource officers do not have a standardization of their training, or the public cannot, in my opinion, expect each resource officer to be the same. Some are there for bullying, some are there for drug issues, some are there for security, but there is no standard training. There is no level 1 resource officer. There is no level 2 resource officer. We're going to push to establish at least some curriculum and expectation when you bring a resource officer into your school. Now, I know the real reason why this, or I suspect the real reason why this question was asked, was do I believe teachers should be armed? The answer is no. In a shooting situation, when an officer is looking in a window and there's a shooting going on in the school, they have no idea of knowing who that is if a teacher's carrying a firearm. I don't ever want to see teachers in that type of setting. But what I would like to see is that each school beef up its security so no shooter ever gets into the school. That's what they're doing all over the country. After 9/11, when the planes crashed into our buildings, the airports across this nation started instituting safety measures to ensure terrorists never get onto our planes. Well, if people target our schools, our children are precious. They are our most important, I guess, vulnerable entity out there. They're our future. If we can't beef up the security at our schools, and a shooter can just bang his way in through the front door easily, then yeah, they're going to continue to be vulnerable. We are trying to address that. I have instituted some legislation to do that, and I hope someday we can all say our schools are safe.
The same person said, should the presence of guns on school property be banned, and I think we all agree. Yeah. Why does any responsible gun owner object to measures that protect public safety, such as universal background checks, red flag law? Trans statistics don't reflect homicides or domestic violence. But you're thinking of
I'll just say it. As a responsible gun owner, I do back those measures, and I hope that others do as well.
I think I've addressed the background check. There are things we can do currently, right now, that are in place around background checks. Most people don't know it, but the U.S. Attorney's Office houses a website at the Department of Public Safety that lists the names of entities that hold a federal license to do background checks, where an individual in a private sale can do a background check right now. Very few people know about it. We're going to be proposing that under the public hearing process that the state currently has, where we put out to the general public a notice that a public hearing's coming up or a work session. Use that to distribute the information. I'll give you a couple pieces of that type of information. I surveyed people in the outdoors, and I was surprised to learn that most people don't know you can't sell a firearm to a non-resident. It is a felony to sell a firearm to a non-resident without a background check. A felony. It'll say Uncle Henry's in some of these publications. And, oh yeah, by the way, I should mention that our governor has pretty much weighed in on this and said, Maine people spoke on universal background checks. So what I'm going to try to look at is ways in which we can provide background checks and information to Mainers so that they can do this. The only exemption to a background check is from Mainer to Mainer. Every one of us, when we sell a firearm, is obligated to look at their driver's license to determine their state of residency. It's already a felony to sell to a non-resident. So, but if you want to beef up background checks, if you want to talk to me about that, I certainly would entertain them. Project Safe Neighborhoods used to provide information and education on where you can do background checks right now. Our organization provides background checks to our members for free. The lady that does it sitting in the 2nd, 4th, 6th, 7th row, and she does a good job of it. She just did a couple the other day. They are going on, but Maine people need to know that that service exists, and also their obligation under current federal law.
I sit on Project Safe Neighborhoods, so I will absolutely make it a point to make sure that information is distributed as far and wide as possible. And I'll just say, in regards to the quote that Governor Mills made in the paper the other day in the Portland Press Herald about background checks, that was an article in which I was also quoted. And I'll just repeat what I said then, which is that the Maine people did speak in 2016. The vote was pretty close, with 2 or 3 points, I think. 6 points. I wasn't here then, so. But the bill that she was speaking about, which was the referendum, again, had all the issues that we've both spoken about, and so I would encourage the governor to, as I did then and I'll do now, and I encourage you to reach out to the governor as well, to say, please take a look at this new bill, and you'll find that it does not have the issues that were so troubling with the last background check bill.
Please clarify briefly, if possible, the differences between the federal and the state of Maine interpretation of the Second Amendment. That might be...
Real quickly. The courts have said we have a right, but in Maine, it's actually Article 1, Section 16. If you have a phone, you can look it up. It's one of the toughest constitutional protections in the nation. We have it here in the state. It says your right shall not be questioned. That doesn't mean that you don't have any gun regulations. It just means we have a very strong constitutional protection. So there is a difference between the federal Second Amendment and Article 1, Section 16. It was interesting. It was a Blue Dog Democrat, that John Martin out of Eagle Lake, that put that and spearheaded that. And and he's seen as Mr. Article 1, Section 16.
Why is the Second Amendment not fully read and followed? Especially with being a member of the militia. In other words, concerning the militia.
This is, I was having a conversation with someone in the hallway about this, and the reason I started my talk about the Supreme Court's interpretation in Heller and McDonald, because they decided that question. There's a tremendous amount of historical scholarship out there about whether or not the prefatory clause, which says in furtherance of a militia, controls the operative clause, which says that someone may possess a firearm. Basically Heller was a massive opinion, voluminous, and it sorted that question out and decided that the operative clause, which is that an individual may possess a firearm, is, I guess, trumps the prefatory clause, which is that for the purposes of a militia, there's certainly an argument in between that there still exists a non-official standing body of a militia that, as armed, stands as a board against the tyranny of the federal government. But the point is that for my purposes and for the purposes of the Maine Gun Safety Coalition, who is trying to enact laws that save lives now, we are confined to, as a part of this republic, what the Supreme Court has interpreted the Second Amendment to mean. So I would just encourage people to read the Heller opinion, read the dissents, do what people are allergic to in law school, which is read the footnotes and find the scholarship that back up the arguments on both sides. It's extremely interesting. There's a good book called Gunfight that was published a few years ago that covers this debate. There's some other really good books out there that cover that topic. So the answer is that is the way the Supreme Court has interpreted it. And I'm not saying it's right, I'm not saying it's wrong, but that's where we stand today.
I think the question was around why isn't the Second Amendment as history taught? I have asked that question for years, and I believe the answer that I've received over and over again from the Maine Civil Liberties Union and others is that no law school in Maine teaches history of the Second Amendment, or teaches the Second Amendment. Why that is probably because it's political. The Maine Civil Liberties Union seems to be exempting the Second Amendment while pushing all the others. You'd have to ask them that question, but the Second Amendment has a very unique history. So does Article 1, Section 16. What I would say to people is that we have a conservative Supreme Court that is unlikely to change the precedent of the Second Amendment. And so we have to work within the guidelines of what that Supreme Court has said. That protection is not going away. For those people that advocate for repeal of the Second Amendment, that would take such an act of Congress in this country that's unlikely to happen in any of our lifetimes. So what can we work on of mutual interest? Like I said in the beginning of my discussion, what can we do together to make our communities safer? I do think it would be important for us in the context of the Constitution to talk about red flag laws. For those of you who understand the Constitution, you have a number of protections under the Constitution. You don't just have the Second Amendment, you have the Fourth Amendment, which protects you from unreasonable search and seizure and confiscation of your property. The Fifth Amendment and the 14th Amendment protect you and ensure that if you are charged with a crime or an accusation made, you have due process. In the case of red flag laws, the court, for the purposes of taking away all of those rights, depends on a third party's opinion of whether you're dangerous or not. That petition, what happens is, if there's an individual that you feel might be acting in a disturbed way, you can go to the court and petition to have their firearms taken away temporarily. That's what they call ex parte, which means without you in attendance. I think we should debate whether that violates your Fourth Amendment, your Fifth, and your 14th Amendment rights. If somebody's gonna come to your door, a police officer with a court order, without your knowledge and say to you after they knock on the door, we want all your firearms and ammunition. I believe you have a right to legal counsel and to defend yourself. Why I say that and why this so concerns me, if you look up CBS, November the 6th, state of Maryland, you will find that a red flag petition was filed against a 61-year-old man, a complaint made by his aunt. And what happened was the cops came to the door. He didn't know who they were. He came to the door with his own handgun. When he opened up the door, the police were there, and they convinced him to put the gun down, which he did. And they then filed the red flag order against him. He picked up the gun, and ensuing battle occurred between the two officers and this individual, and he was shot to death in his own home. There was never an accusation of a crime. There was no due process for this individual. Not only did he have his rights taken away, he had his life taken away. And he never had a chance to challenge the order that was brought against him. That's why when we have debates about laws like red flag, it is incredibly important that we have a thorough public debate and all issues are understood and all elements of the Constitution are taken into consideration.
Thank you, Mr. Turan.
So, I was a public defender, I was the criminal defense attorney. I don't think I was a very good one because I had to say, you know what else can be taken away on ex parte or one-sided accusation? Your liberty. Because I represented probably 10,000 people where someone made an accusation and the prosecution filed charges and they were arrested and then the judge said no bail. Or your bail is $10,000, which is unreasonable for anybody to make. So there's lots of immediate freedoms that are able to be compromised under our present legal system on an ex parte basis, including whether or not you are at liberty or not. But here's a list of things you can lose on an ex parte basis temporarily. Your home, your child, to name a few. And in fact, right now, there's in Maine law, there's protection from abuse law, which allows a firearm to be confiscated on the accusation of someone that they feel threatened by a domestic partner or spouse or boyfriend or girlfriend, and that person holds a firearm. And that's been the law of the state for quite a long time. And our law that we've put forward in the red flag bill is essentially the same thing. All it does is allow for a family member to do the same thing that a person in a romantic relationship could do. That's it. And if this bill passed as it's written now, would be, I think, the first state, if not one of the first states, that would automatically appoint counsel for someone indigent at the return hearing in 14 days, or under 14 days. I know that's an issue for other states don't have that, and both sides come unrepresented usually, or the petitioner, who is the person seeking the order restricting access to firearms, would be represented by the Attorney General's office or the prosecutor's office, but in our state, under our bill, you would be afforded attorney. There's, again, keep the red flag in context of the laws that already exist here and all the other myriad ways in which your rights and liberties can be infringed on an ex parte basis on a temporary timeline.
I do thank you for adding the attorney back in there because that was my request 2 years ago. That bill that was introduced 2 years ago did not have legal representation, so that is a minor improvement to the bill, and we do thank you for that. Okay. I want to speak about the protection from abuse orders for a moment, because I was asked a question about domestic violence and the connection between firearms and domestic violence. Domestic violence, in a time a person's shot and killed with a firearm in a domestic violence situation, is a tragedy, horrible tragedy, and it happens. Thank God it happens in a small degree in Maine compared to the rest of the state. And part of that reason that is that there was a protection from abuse order process to allow the temporary taking of firearms. That was put forward by our organization. And what it does is when there's been an accusation of a domestic violence assault or a complaint made, the police can come and take those firearms for a short period of time until it's resolved by the courts. I served on the Governor LePage's task force to examine that law, and we made, that not too long ago, 2013, made 11 recommendations to improve that law. I'm proud of that fact. It included information for potential victims when they go to the courts. There's nobody really there to explain how to do an order and what resources are available to them. There was the proper storage of firearms issue. Law enforcement do not want to keep and store your firearms, just so you know. It's a hassle, it's a pain in the butt for them to do it. So that was recognized as a big problem. Procedures on how the information was handled. These types of policies have real life application. And let me give you an example, what I mean by that. There was one incident in which a father, he assaulted his now ex-wife because she's dead. The firearms were taken by the police in an order, transferred to a son. Because they were put in the son's custody, they were accessible by this individual. He went to his son's home, and he browbeat his son, he threatened him, got the guns, or a gun, and went back and killed her with it. That gun created a false sense, or that protection from abuse order, created a false sense of security. What I said when I was on that task force is, under no circumstances should that ever happen again. It shouldn't happen in the beginning. One reason why I put that gun safe bill forward was so that I could promote gun safes being used in any situation in which a firearm is removed. Maybe that gun safe could be in the possession of the family member who holds the guns, or maybe these police departments should have gun safes in which they house the firearms. But under no circumstances should that ever happen again.
What is your position on firearms registration? Some cities have this and some don't. What is your position on firearms registration? Some cities have this and some don't.
Probably the most fearful of all the laws that you could possibly pass is gun registration. And the reason is that historically, when individuals like Hitler instituted gun registries, we know where it led. It's a fear of gun owners that they have to go to their government and register their firearms. That's just the reality. The federal government is illegal to create a gun owner registry federally, so it's not going to happen. We do have a law in Maine that makes it illegal to keep a comprehensive firearm registry. I know because I drafted it. And it is not to stop police officers in their departments from having lists of felons who are prohibited or other firearm-related small databases of people who have committed crimes. That's totally acceptable. But we couldn't even have a gun registry system here unless we had a change in federal law.
I'll only say that the supremacy clause requires that Maine be subject to that same law. I personally have not studied the issue closely enough to know whether or not it has a significant impact on gun safety and the prevention of violence. So I won't take a stand on this point.
Why is the Second Amendment not limited to use a militia or for hunting? What is the proof?
We just asked that, Sam.
Is why is the Second Amendment not limited to use in militia or for hunting, -proof question mark? I think we kind of answered that before with the opinion in Heller.
Might be.
Yeah. The Second Amendment itself doesn't mention hunting, nor does Section 16. But I will say that the opinion in Heller did mention hunting as a long-standing part of our American tradition, and for which individuals possessed firearms. And again, we're bound by that Supreme Court decision.
This is for Mr. Tran. Why does the very concept of gun safety create so much of a reaction among gun owners? What is your definition of gun safety for everyone?
Well, my definition of gun safety, well, gun control is a completely different issue, and I think it gets blended with gun safety. Gun safety is being a responsible citizen with your rights, whether it's the First Amendment, Second Amendment, or any other amendment. We have rights in this country, but when I, as a firearm owner, when I bring a gun into any environment, whether as a hunter, a recreational shooter, or into my home, I have a responsibility to make sure that that firearm never hurts another individual, myself or otherwise. And I think that that's the foundation of firearm safety. In Maine, we have a requirement to go hunting, hunter safety class. It ends up being 4 nights where an individual has to give up their time, go in and take a course in how to be a responsible hunter. Most of that is around hunter safety. I'm going to throw this out there because it's something unique, and I'll bet Jeff agrees with me on this one. Under that Pittman-Robertson tax that I mentioned earlier today, that money comes back and it funds our hunter safety class. Because the tax comes from long guns and ammunition, the federal government does not allow handgun safety training to be taught in that 4-day course. They won't pay for it, because handguns are very seldom used for hunting purposes. I've been promoting, and I believe there'll be a bill coming forward directing inland fisheries and wildlife to create a handgun component to their hunter safety class. And the reason that is because handguns are the firearm where most accidents occur, not long guns. Most crimes are created or crimes are committed using a handgun. So having 6,000 new hunters exposed with their parents to hunter safety and firearm education to exclude handguns is ludicrous. So I believe that will be debated, and I suspect will be adopted. It's something we should have been doing years ago.
I absolutely agree that that should be part of the hunter safety course, but I would take it a step further and say that Maine should join the plethora of other states that require a handgun safety course at the time of purchase of a handgun. And so they would get the same training when they purchase a handgun, whether or not they wanted to use it for hunting purposes or not. And you create a funding scheme for that, just as you did for the hunter safety program.
Just let me explain to you why that's a problem. No other constitutional protection that you have requires you to take a course before you exercise it. If so, I'd create a First Amendment course for some reporters who will go over the line a little bit. That's not to say I don't have a lot of respect for the reporters in Maine, but none of us have to have a course to exercise our First Amendment rights or any other right. And that's really what happens when you have a course that says you have to take a handgun safety course before you can buy a firearm. That is a de facto ban on your firearm rights.
I'll just say that many other states require this, and very few people there that I know of in those states complain about it. It's not onerous. It's 2 days or 2 nights or 3 nights set by the state. That there's a wide range of organizations that offer the training, including the NRA, who trains the trainers on the program. It's true, there isn't any other constitutional right that requires you to engage in a form of training beforehand. But there's no other constitutional right that confers upon you the ability to so immediately kill yourself or your family members or other. And so that should require a little bit of a training. You don't have a constitutional right, you have a due process right to a driver's license, not a constitutional right, but certainly your ability to injure yourself or someone else requires that you have training and then pass a licensing test first. And I don't suspect many people in this room would argue that we should stop licensing drivers and stop ensuring that they know how to operate a motor vehicle before we send them out on 95. So I think the same principle applies here. And again, this is not a significant burden. We're not talking about an overwhelming burden. We're not saying, we're saying you have to take a 2 or 3 day, a 3-night course so you know how to safely operate a gun. That's it.